and welcome to Rising. We have a wonderful Monday morning show planned for you all today, and it's so wonderful to see Batya Ungar-Sargon. Hello, Batya.
Good morning, Robby. How was your weekend?
Mine was very nice. Easter weekend, of course. Didn't really actually do very much, but and was hoping for slightly warmer weather, but, you know, no complaints. How was yours?
Good to hear. I have eaten a lot of matzah, so, you know, very excited for that to pass.
All right. Well, what are we talking about on the show today?
Well, we've got a big show coming up. Let's get right into it. The Department of Justice has opened an investigation after a trove of top secret defense documents spread on social media last week. The documents, which first appeared on Discord about a month ago, detail U.S. intelligence's extensive spy campaign, even against key allies, including Israel, South Korea, and Ukraine. The leaks also reveal the U.S. military's extensive involvement in the day-to-day logistics of the war in Ukraine, leaving some members of the intelligence community rattled. They say the relative freshness of the documents, some of them are around just a month old, about 40 days old, means that their leaking could have dire consequences on U.S. and NATO operations in Ukraine. According to the Times, quote, while President Biden has barred American troops from firing directly on Russian targets and blocked sending weapons that could reach deep into Russian territory, the documents make clear that a year into the invasion, the United States is heavily entangled in almost everything else. So, Robby, when I saw this news, I had sort of two main thoughts. My first was, so what does the revelation of this extensive U.S. spying operation deep in the Russian war machine and Russian government and every level of basically the Russian intelligence operations, what does that mean for Evan Gershkovich's release? I mean, another humiliating moment for Vladimir Putin. Does this make it more or less likely that we can get that Wall Street journalist home? And I just fear that this is not going to be a moment that Putin will be open to negotiations. Of course, this confirms what a lot of us already knew, which was that the U.S. was providing intensive on-the-ground support. Everything from the weapons themselves to coordinating locations within Russia that are going to be targets. So the question, I think, becomes, at what point does Russia view this as, not a Cold War anymore, but a hot war between the U.S. and Russia, which, of course, would be disastrous?
Right. Really, it's confirmation of a lot of things that we kind of, that we suspected. We know the U.S. has a vast spying intelligence operation. We know that we deploy that against not just hostile or ostensibly hostile nations like Russia, but we spy on Israel, we spy on our friends too, and they do that to us. That's the way the modern intelligence world works. But we are seeing, we see from this intelligence, yes, the level of detail and involvement U.S. forces have in planning the Ukrainian war. And some of these distinctions that are being drawn, well, U.S. troops are not specifically supposed to fire on Russian forces or advise on things that would affect in the interior of Russia. Like, are these distinctions Putin is going to make? Is he going to say, oh, yeah, well, the U.S. isn't involved, it hasn't declared war on Russia because they're only involved in the X, Y, and Z ways? I don't know. If you look at this, you would, conclude that we're assisting, we're sort of directing the Ukrainian resistance, which, look, if you think that's appropriate, you have to, has Congress authorized that? Has Congress,
right,
the body of our government that is responsible for declaring war, did they authorize the president to carry out a war against Russia, defense of Ukraine? No, they didn't. So I think it can be confusing on that level. I also just kind of find it frankly interesting that, however, when we don't know exactly how these documents leaked in the first place, it could have been, there are a number of countries we share a lot of intelligence with, Canada, Australia, the UK, et cetera. It could have been one of those, actually, someone there with access to the information who shared it. But it was on Discord for a month before anyone really noticed it. And it became a story that, wow, there's these intelligence documents out there, which I think just goes to show, it's just kind of wild how big the internet is. That you could publish something on the internet, a public place, Discord, a forum, a platform for discussion, and have it not actually like attract the attention of the government or the news media, the people who'd say, hey, wait a minute, that's our secret stuff. We don't want anybody seeing that for a month. That's kind of wild.
Right. And it's important to note, I think, that there are two competing versions of the documents. Pro-Russian sources have shared a version of the documents that has the casualty count for Ukraine and for Russia, but the pro-Russian version appears to have been doctored to have swapped the numbers and make it look like the Ukrainian casualties are much higher. So according to the documents being shared by the news media in America, at least, the ones that appear to be the original documents show that Ukraine has had 17 soldiers killed in action compared to Russia's 42,000, I believe was the number. And the casualty numbers, of course, much higher. Casualty numbers for the Ukraine were somewhere like 170,000. And then for Russia, I think up to 225,000. But in the pro-Russia sources, there's been a doctored version that flips that and has the Ukrainian casualties, somewhere like, 90,000 killed in action, which we don't believe to be the case. So very interesting and very important to keep an eye on, which of these are verified and which of these are not. I will say another extremely interesting thing that has not gotten a lot of attention is that according to our spying on Israel, it appears that the Mossad was very heavily involved in encouraging and even, instigating these mass protests that we saw against Benjamin Netanyahu's proposed judicial reform against the Supreme Court. Make of that what you will. I assume there's going to now be a big conversation about the deep state in Israel as well, because the Mossad historically has never interfered in domestic politics. So that was a really interesting piece of the puzzle. And of course, the South Korean piece. I mean, South Korea is not going to be happy to know, and for the world to know, that we were spying on such a close ally. Yeah.
The deep state element of the Israeli angle is fascinating to see if that country increasingly has the same kind of thing we're seeing here in terms of intelligence officials, national security officials, kind of the government bureaucracy working against the president, which is obviously what a lot of Trump supporters think and can present some credible evidence for, was happening here in terms of, the dissemination of the kind of Russian interference, Russian collusion narrative that took on social media that was really pushed by people in the FBI and national intelligence gathering. Right. A lot of that ended up being overstated, but so deeply affected the discourse in a negative way for the elected president, Donald Trump. So to see that taking, I guess it's not really surprising. I wonder if every country has their version of a permanent federal bureaucracy or whatever they call it, working sometimes with counter aims to the elected political officials. It's very, very interesting and I think troubling. This is not a pro-democracy trend, I would say, where a permanent bureaucracy of so-called experts works against the interests of the people actually voted into office by the citizens of the country. Does not seem like a democracy maximizing trend. Of course, the kind of media creatures bought into it say exactly the opposite, that they're defending democracy by doing this kind of thing from the political appointees. Doesn't make sense to me, but that's the way the narrative breaks on that one.
I will also say, I think it's very interesting who leaked these documents, right? I mean, in whose interest were these documents leaked? I mean, for people like us who are sort of skeptical of our level of involvement in this and want to see some sort of negotiated peace settlement, right? Does the leak of this document, the knowledge that we've, acquired from them, does that make that more likely or less likely, right? Which would help us kind of answer who would have done this, right? Who saw this as in their interest? Because you could sort of see both sides of it, right? On the one hand, I think it's not great for Ukraine that, everybody has all of this information about how deeply embedded the U.S. is. It's going to force certain questions, just like you mentioned, Robby, about has Congress authorized this? Of course, unfortunately, they have not done enough to voice, if there is any opposition to it. There's not been much voicing of it, that sort of humiliating walkback of the progressive letter. On the other hand, you could, what possibly could the Russian response to this be other than to dig in further, right? I mean, it's not a great moment right now. I mean, so it's just interesting to think about how this complicates our involvement further and what happens next.
Yeah, it does not seem like something that's going to get us closer to peace, unfortunately.
Yeah.
All right, we will have radars coming up next. Stay tuned.